Morning. In this session, we are going to finish the slides on the muscular system and make up for the two sessions that we have missed because of Thursday's or today's day off. As we have said before in the class, there is a certain hierarchy for the energy provided to the muscle. And in this diagram, we are going to discuss or highlight this hierarchy, and we are also going to see the importance of creatine for muscle contraction. This structure represents a blood vessel or one of the blood vessels that supply the muscle with blood. And as you know, blood contains oxygen gas and dissolved in the plasma and carried on hemoglobin. And it also contains the nutrients or the final products of digestion, which are the simplest molecules, very simple, very small, very soluble in water, so that they can circulate in blood and they can reach the muscle cell at the end of their journey. So what you can see here on the right side is the content of a muscle, or are the contents of a muscle cell, or the contents of a myofiber. As you can see, blood comes to a muscle cell through the arterial blood supply carrying glucose, and glucose, as you know, is the most abundant monosaccharide, and it also carries the very important gas, oxygen. It carries another important molecule, which is the fatty acids. Actually, only fatty acids with a very small molecular weight will be dissolved in plasma, whereas the fatty acids that have a larger molecular weight will not be soluble in water and therefore will be carried by lymphatics, but will finally reach the circulation. As you can see here, we have glycogen, which is one of the complex polysaccharides in the human body. And as we know, glycogen is a polysaccharide that is stored inside the muscle cells and inside the liver cells. And here we can see that there are glycogen stores inside the muscle cell. Glucose will pass from the blood to the inside of the muscle cell or to the sarcoplasm. But when glucose is depleted from the blood because the muscle is exerting at a high rate, then the muscle will start breaking down glycogen to get more and more of the glucose molecules. And therefore, the skeletal muscle or the cardiac muscle will not undergo this process of breakdown of glycogen to give rise to glucose unless glucose in the blood has much, or glucose levels in the blood have much diminished. So the first source of energy for the cell, for the muscle cell, is glucose under normal conditions. If the muscle is exerting heavily, then glycogen stores inside the muscle itself will be broken down to give glucose. And then in the presence of oxygen, we will have a process of aerobic respiration. And the process of aerobic respiration means that we have oxygen, means that this process occurs in the presence of oxygen, and respiration means breakdown of the nutrient or the glucose molecules to release energy. So this process of aerobic respiration that occurs in the cell is called aerobic cellular respiration, and it consists of two processes. The first one is glycolysis, and this one occurs in the cytosol. And the second one is what we call oxidative phosphorylation. Oxidative because we are using oxygen, because oxygen is important, and phosphorylation because there will be addition of phosphate to ADP. Both glycolysis that occurs in the cytosol and oxidative phosphorylation together form the whole process of aerobic cellular respiration. Glycolysis is common between aerobic and aerobic respiration, but oxidative phosphorylation that occurs in the mitochondria, as you might be studying later on in AP biology, inshallah, occurs exclusively in case of aerobic respiration because it necessitates the presence of oxygen. And that's why here you can see that the arrow shows that oxygen diffuses from the blood to the inside of the cell to be ready to share in the process of oxidative phosphorylation. Sometimes when we don't have enough glucose and when all the glycogen stores in the muscle have also been depleted, we refer to fatty acids. And that's why the small molecules of fatty acids or fatty acids with a small molecular weight might also diffuse from the blood into the cell to undergo the process of breakdown to release energy or aerobic cellular respiration. What does this mean? This means that if you are exerting heavily for a long period of time, you're not only depleting your glucose levels in the blood, but also depleting your glycogen stores in the muscle and in the liver. And most importantly, at the end of the day, if you continue exercising without having a new supply of glucose molecules, then you're going to break down your fat, and more fat will be displaced from the fat tissue under your skin to be converted into fatty acids and then to join the process of breakdown in aerobic cellular respiration. And that's why people lose weight if they exercise heavily without having a concomitant supply or in parallel supply of glucose. And now we are going to clarify the role of creatine phosphate in all this. Creatine is present inside the muscle cell, and creatine is present in the muscle cell in the form of creatine phosphate. And creatine is important because whenever the process of aerobic cellular respiration occurs, what happens, or part of the process, is that creatine phosphate is converted into creatine. So what did creatine phosphate lose? Actually, it lost a phosphate group. So in order for creatine phosphate to be converted into creatine only, it lost the phosphate group. And as you see, that phosphate group is there, is here, and it is added to adenosine diphosphate, which originally had 2 phosphate groups, to convert it into adenosine triphosphate. Adenosine triphosphate is very important for both muscular contraction and muscular relaxation. As you know, myosin fibrils look like parallel threads, and each myosin fibril has a head. And in order for that head to bind on specific active sites on actin and to carry out this energetic stroke to force the actin filaments to slide over myosin, we should have energy that results from hydrolysis of ATP. And this is the role of the ATPase enzyme. So the ATPase enzyme is a hydrolytic enzyme. It hydrolyzes ATP once again into ADP and phosphate to release energy. And this energy is important for the myosin heads to do their characteristic stroke on the actin filaments to pull them towards the center and result in shortening of the whole sarcomere. But if the myosin heads stay attached to actin, then the muscle would stay contracted, as you know, and this would result in a muscle cramp or in prolonged contracture of the muscle. Contracture differs from contraction. Contraction is just a contraction, but contracture is a T-U-R-E actually, T-U-R-E, is prolonged contraction that is unhealthy to the muscle, and that is associated with pain and associated with depletion of ATP. So we will need ATP for the myosin to relax again, and therefore we need another calcium-dependent ATPase hydrolysis to release another bout of energy and to help the myosin to detach. So contraction is associated with attachment of the myosin heads, whereas relaxation is associated with detachment. Just like we have just said that fatty acids might be used in case of depletion of the muscles from glycogen stores, proteins are also used, and actually they are even used before fatty acids. So we can say that we first use glucose and then the glycogen stores and then the amino acids that are present in the cell. Where have these amino acids come from? They might have come from the final products of digestion, the amino acids in the circulation that come from the digestive system after having been absorbed in the ileum of the small intestine, or in serious conditions, you might even be breaking down the proteins of your muscle. So these proteins will be broken down into amino acids, and amino acids, just like fatty acids, just like glucose, can be broken down through aerobic respiration to give rise to ATP. So if you don't have glucose, you deplete your glycogen stores. If you already depleted your glycogen stores, then you will break down the proteins in the muscles. If you don't have, if your muscles no more contain amino acids, you're going to break down the fats under your, actually it is the fatty acids that are broken down before the amino acids, because usually we finish all the glucose and then, I apologize, guys. We finish all the glucose and then we deplete all the glycogen. And then after having depleted all the glycogen with all the symptoms and signs that accompany this because of adrenaline. Adrenaline hormone is responsible for that breakdown, and that's why it is associated with nervousness, with tremors, with shaking, maybe with the cold extremities, with irritability. And then after having finished that, if you don't have enough glucose supplements for long, for example, if you're starving, or if you don't find food for a reason or another, then you will be using your fatty acids, and therefore you will become skinny, and you will lose all the fat under the skin, and finally you will be destroying the proteins of your muscles. And now we move on to an important concept, which is the oxygen debt. You know, as we have just said, that oxygen is important for cellular respiration. And cellular respiration, as we have just seen, especially the last stage that requires oxygen, which is called oxidative phosphorylation, requires ATP. If you are exerting maximally, if you are exerting at a very rapid rate, then your muscles would need huge amounts of ATP, and therefore you would definitely need large amounts of oxygen in order to provide, to cope with, this verb is very important here, to cope with your muscle needs, to cope with muscle needs, since these muscles are exerting heavily. However, after several minutes of heavy exertion, although your lungs are breathing maximally in order to intake oxygen maximally, and oxygen is diffusing maximally to the blood, and your heart is beating at the maximum possible rate to deliver oxygen or to deliver blood that is full of oxygen to the cell. Yet this oxygen will not meet the demands of your muscle, and therefore the muscle has to refer to another process that helps it get ATP, even if that process is not as efficient as aerobic respiration, and even if that process would have side effects. So what process would the muscle do? The muscle will carry out anaerobic respiration. Which type of anaerobic respiration? Because we have two types of anaerobic respiration, acidic fermentation and alcoholic fermentation. It will refer to acidic fermentation. So what is fermentation? Fermentation is a process that is carried out by certain organisms like yeast or certain tissues like muscle tissues in the absence of oxygen. So it is an anaerobic process. And since it is a respiration process, then it is associated with breakdown of glucose. But this process results in the formation of something that a side item that wasn't formed in aerobic respiration, and that side item is lactic acid. Why? Because, as you know, when glucose is broken down, it passes through a process called glycolysis, and I've just said that glycolysis is common between aerobic and anaerobic respiration. And glycolysis results in breakdown of some of the bonds of glucose, and it does not require oxygen. So it is a partial breakdown of glucose. Glycolysis is a partial breakdown of glucose. It releases only 2 ATPs, so it does not give a lot of ATP molecules. It occurs in the cytosol, meaning that it occurs in the cytosol, meaning that you don't enter the mitochondrion, and it does not need oxygen. It might occur in the absence of oxygen, but if there is oxygen, it can also proceed. This glycolysis is common whether we have oxygen or we don't have oxygen. But the difference is, if the glucose molecule undergoes glycolysis first, which is a common routine whether you have oxygen or not, but after having been partially broken down in the cytosol through the process, glycolysis is a process, by the way, it will have different pathways according to whether you have oxygen or you don't have oxygen. If you have oxygen, then it will continue breakdown and undergo oxidative phosphorylation and produce a lot of ATP molecules, 38 ATP molecules per mole of oxygen. But if you don't have oxygen, then oxidative phosphorylation will not occur, and another process will occur, which is a reductive process, and that reductive process will result in the formation of lactic acid and only 2 ATP molecules. So the problem here is that you produce lactic acid, and that lactic acid is responsible for that soreness, that burning pain that you feel in your muscle whenever you exercise for long. More and more accumulation of lactic acid results in more and more soreness, might even result in cramps. Lactic acid results in soreness directly, but the presence of lactic acid indicates what? It indicates that we are going anaerobically, that there is ATP depletion and therefore, since there is ATP depletion, we might suffer from cramps as well. So the soreness is due to lactic acid. The cramps are due to ATP depletion. Why do we call that status a state of oxygen debt? Because how are we going to get rid of that? We have two problems now. We have lactic acid that causes the soreness, and we have depletion of ATP. So these two problems that make your condition very uncomfortable can be worked out or can be solved by resuming or replenishing oxygen in your body, replenishing the cells with oxygen. If you replenish your muscle cells with oxygen, then you will respire aerobically. Then you will have more and more of the ATP. So the ATP will increase once again, and no more lactic acid will be formed because you are no more respiring anaerobically. And even the remains, the rest of lactic acid that resulted from the previous anaerobic respiration will be washed away by the blood. And that's why we before replenishing your stores of oxygen, you are in a state of oxygen debt. You don't have oxygen, so you are respiring in the absence of oxygen. You are respiring anaerobically. You are producing lactic acid. You're running short of ATP, and this is the condition of oxygen debt. So the oxygen debt is what causes the athlete to spend a minute or two having rapid deep breathing after strenuous exercise, meaning that in the latest stages of a strenuous or very exhausting muscle exercise, the muscle was breaking down glucose anaerobically. So ATP was almost was very, very scanty in the muscle cell, and lactic acid was accumulating. And now you finished your muscular exercise, you sit down, you have some rest, but although you are resting, yet you are still breathing maximally. Why are you still breathing maximally? Because you want to do what we have just discussed in the previous slide. You want to replenish your stores of oxygen. So this rapid deep breathing is to replenish your stores of oxygen in a trial to work out all these problems. And therefore, this oxygen debt will be repaid quickly as additional oxygen becomes available. The lungs are again breathing rapidly, the heart is beating rapidly, trying to deliver the oxygen that is now available. Wasn't oxygen available before? It was available and in the same maximum quantity, but the problem before you had rest was that the muscular exercise was out of proportion, or the muscle needs were out of proportion to the delivered oxygen. Okay? So the oxygen debt is repaid when additional oxygen is available, but muscle soreness may persist until all the metabolic waste like lactic acid have been washed away, or until lactic acid is oxidized once again. So we have like two solutions for lactic acid, or three actually. The first solution is that when you stop exercise, you stop producing lactic acid. This is number one. Number two, being washed away by the circulation. Number three, being oxidized, because if lactic acid, if oxygen is available, lactic acid will be oxidized. And if lactic acid is oxidized, it will give rise to a compound called pyruvic acid, and pyruvic acid can continue aerobic respiration and can join the process of oxidative phosphorylation we've just talked about. Now we're going to discuss some of the muscular disorders, the disorders that affect the muscle. We have already mentioned some injuries to the muscle. We have mentioned muscle bruises. We have mentioned muscle strains. We have mentioned sprains in ligaments and joints that are very close to the muscles. We have mentioned muscle lacerations, but all these are traumatic conditions. Now we're going to discuss non-traumatic diseases of the muscles, and the myopathies are a rare but important disease of muscles. Disease of muscle, an important group of diseases that affect the muscles, and they're actually targeting the myofibers themselves. Some of these myopathies, which are diseases of the muscle fibers themselves, might be congenital. That means that you have the genes. They are congenital and hereditary. Congenital is something you're born with. It might be hereditary or non-hereditary, but myopathies are congenital and hereditary. Congenital because you're born with them. Hereditary because the reason why you were born for them is that you have an abnormal gene. So they are inheritable, meaning that they can pass from parents to offspring. Some of the hereditary diseases, as we will see later on, are inherited through the dad. Some others are inherited through the mom. But sometimes they are not inherited, sometimes they are acquired, meaning that people, for example, might be born normally and they don't have any congenital myopathies, but later on in life they take a medication, for example, whose side effect is, so you might take a drug whose side effect is weakness of the muscle, or you might, for example, suffer from a metabolic disease like renal failure that affects the muscles and results in their weakness, diabetes mellitus, renal failure, liver diseases. Myopathies are associated with weakness of the muscles, and from here comes the importance of myopathies. Although they are rare diseases, but when they occur, they might be fatal, because if myopathies affect the muscles of breathing, the chest muscles, then those muscles become too weak to support inhalation and exhalation. So you might have a normal heart, you might have a completely normal heart, completely normal lungs, a completely normal brain, yet you cannot breathe because the effector muscles cannot contract and relax to force air in or to force air out. If we start by congenital myopathies, they will appear, of course, very early in life, and they will result in developmental delay. You know that when we have a newborn, there is a certain chart or a certain timeline for the progress of the motor skills of that child. For example, the child starts sitting at 6 months, crawling at 8 months, walking at 15 months, for example, or 18 months. So there will be a delay in all this. And usually congenital myopathies affect all muscles, and therefore these children are risking their life because of, as we said before, weakness in the muscle of breathing, the muscles of breathing. But usually it's not progressive, meaning that you are born with the maximum weakness that will affect you, and it will not increase more than this. The treatment, of course, is extremely expensive, and that's why individual families cannot afford treating their kids, and it should be something that is governmental, or there might be charity, for example, programs for collecting money for those, for collecting money for those people. On the other hand, we have another type of, or one of the examples, of congenital myopathies is mitochondrial myopathies. Of course, any mitochondrial disease in the human body is exclusively inherited from your mom, because when the sperm fertilizes the egg, the piece of the sperm that contains the mitochondria is not included in the process of fertilization, and therefore the zygote, which is the future human being, contains mitochondria only from the egg of the mom or from the ovum of the mom. So any mitochondrial disease will be inherited from the part of the mom only. Why is there a relationship between mitochondria and myopathies? Because mitochondria are the powerhouses of the body, meaning that most ATP is produced inside the mitochondria through a process of cellular respiration. And therefore, if your mitochondria for a reason or another are not working properly, then there would be inadequate production of ATP. And ATP, as you know, is essential for muscle contraction. And this deficit in ATP or those defective amounts of ATP will not only result in weakness of the skeletal muscles, but weakness of the cardiac muscles. The lack of ATP might also affect brain function. Muscles in the gastrointestinal tract might also be affected. There is another type. So, of course, mitochondrial myopathies are an example of congenital myopathies. Mitochondrial myopathies are congenital, whereas metabolic myopathies are acquired. Actually, some of them are genetic and some are acquired, because the one we are explaining in this slide is a genetic one, but as I told you before, they are acquired. They might be a side effect of a drug, or they might be a side effect of a metabolic disease that affects metabolism and energy production, like diabetes. But they might also be genetic, as we see here. Metabolic myopathies are characterized by, when they are congenital, there is episodic muscle weakness. And that episodic muscle weakness means that it is not continuous. It's not like the previous example when we had the mitochondrial myopathies. It was the maximum weakness and it was continuous throughout life. But metabolic myopathies are only seen, if they are congenital, they are only seen when you exercise. Why? When you exercise, because there are increased demands for ATP, type. Why don't my mitochondria produce a lot of ATP when needed? Because the gene or the genes that code for certain enzymes inside the mitochondria. So again, since it is a defect in the gene, then it is a genetic disease. And since it is a genetic disease, then it is then it is a hereditary disease. And since it is a hereditary disease, you will be born with it, and it is a congenital disease. So there are defects in the enzymes that work in the mitochondria. So the mitochondria cannot produce adequate amounts of ATP molecules. They cannot produce adequate amounts of ATP. So actually, you might be asking yourself, or you might be wondering, what's the difference between metabolic myopathies and mitochondrial myopathies? Metabolic myopathies are the general name. So I apologize, because metabolic myopathies, the slide for metabolic myopathies should have been presented before the slide on mitochondrial myopathies, because in metabolic myopathies, you have a mutation in the gene that codes for enzymes that are important for the production of ATP. Production of ATP can occur in the cytosol, in glycolysis, for example, and can occur mostly in the mitochondrion. And metabolic myopathies are the broad name for any disease that will be associated with muscle weakness because of a defect in the gene, a mutation in the gene that codes for a particular enzyme, and that enzyme speeds up reactions that produce ATP. So mitochondrial myopathies are nothing but a subclass of metabolic myopathies, or an example of metabolic myopathies, and they represent a big weight in metabolic myopathies. And now come muscular dystrophies. The main difference between muscular dystrophies and myopathies is that those dystrophies are mainly progressive, meaning that their intensity increases with time. We have seen in congenital myopathies that they are stable throughout life, and then we have seen an example of stable congenital myopathies. By the way, metabolic and mitochondrial myopathies are mainly congenital myopathies, although, as I said before, metabolic myopathies are sometimes acquired due to a side effect of medication or a disease. So again, we have congenital myopathies. The best example for congenital myopathies are the mitochondrial myopathies. The mitochondrial myopathies are stable throughout life. Some types of metabolic myopathies show mainly during exercise. This is normal. And we have then the muscular dystrophies, which are also congenital myopathies, but they are characterized by progressive weakness, meaning that, for example, in some cases, we might find that the disease starts, for example, in the lower limbs, and then, so the lower limbs first become weak, and then the muscles of the trunk, and then the upper limbs, and then finally the muscles of the chest, and this is the most serious condition. And all muscular dystrophies are characterized by degeneration of the muscular tissue, meaning that gradually, why do the muscles weaken gradually? They weaken gradually because the muscular tissue degenerates. Why does the muscular tissue degenerate? Because the structural support proteins, like for example collagen, is not normal. So here the main problem is an abnormality in the structural proteins. For example, if you have the myofibers like this, and there is connective tissue in between, and that connective tissue contains collagen. So in spite of the collagen fibers being normal, parallel to each other, elastic like this, they might themselves be abnormal, and this results in, by a process that is not, or that will not be explained in the scope of that curriculum, they will result finally in damage and degeneration of the muscle. On the other hand, we have myasthenia gravis. Myasthenia gravis is an autoimmune disorder, but myasthenia gravis means, in myasthenia gravis, which is a chronic disease, by the way, and which is an autoimmune disorder, meaning that you still have genetic predisposition, but you are not necessarily born with myasthenia gravis. There are antibodies against your own muscle fibers. So it is an autoimmune disorder. Antibodies will destroy which part in particular in the muscle? They destroy the communication between the nerve and the muscle fiber, meaning that if this is the nerve fiber and this is the muscle fiber, and this is the myoneural junction, or the place where the nerve ending comes close to the muscle, and in between them there is space called the synapse. Then it is that area that is damaged, the communication between the nerve fiber and the muscle that is supplied by the nerve fiber, and this results in progressive weakness of the muscle, and it affects the voluntary muscles in the body, especially the muscles of the eye. So the patient might suffer from squint, for example, because the muscles are not working properly or in harmony. The muscles of the throat, so the patient might find difficulty swallowing, and the muscles of the limbs, upper limbs and lower limbs. After having finished the diseases, we will talk about things that you are interested in, like creatine. Creatine, as we have said, is a molecule that is present in the muscle, and it helps rapid release of energy to the muscle during anaerobic respiration. If you take creatine like half an hour or 1 hour maximum before your exercise, this time interval, 30 to 60 minutes or half an hour to 1 hour, is enough for creatine to reach maximum levels in your blood. And if some caffeine is added with it, then this will result in great athletic performance. Why? Because, as we said before, creatine facilitates the delivery of ATP to the muscle, or not the delivery actually, but facilitates the formation of ATP inside the muscle fiber during exercise. Usually, the acceptable doses of creatine are safe, but the problem is that sometimes these supplements are, or athletes actually, or their coaches actually abuse giving them those supplements in order to get better and better results, especially in competitions, and this might turn out to be harmful because it results in kidney damage. Because when you give more creatine, the breakdown products will need to be excreted by the kidney, and this necessitates an increased blood flow to the kidney that is a burden on the kidney. Another damage of taking creatine is that the body might stop forming its own creatine. Of course, amino acids that reach the muscle cell are necessary for building up muscles, and therefore they promote recovery after some muscles have been injured. For example, during heavy muscular exercise, they will help building muscle, and therefore they improve your performance. And just as we said, in case of creatine, in average doses, they are beneficial, but in large doses, they are a burden on the kidney and a burden on the liver. Anabolic agents are usually steroids in nature. They are anabolic hormones, and anabolic hormones promote building up of muscles because they promote a very important process, which is building up of proteins or synthesis of proteins. But they are usually androgenic, and therefore, if taken by females, they might result in deepening of the voice of a female or appearance of abnormal hair on the face. By this, we would have ended this idea of slow fibers, and fast fibers will be discussed, inshallah, in class, because it's interesting and it needs explanation, but I don't want the video to be lengthy. So I'll be stopping here, and if you are interested, we can discuss this together in the classroom, inshallah. Thank you, guys, and see you on Tuesday. You'll be having a chapter test, but those slides are not included in the chapter test. You will just have a homework related to these. Thank you, and see you on Tuesday.